And yeah, I normally start off with introducing myself, but that's I think enough of an introduction. But it's nice to meet everyone. In terms of like, kind of getting to know each other a little bit today, I'd like today to be as interactive as possible. But I also know I can talk for a very long time. So I'm going to try and get through because I think there's some important information. But if at any point someone wants to put their camera on, unmute their mic, pitch in, I absolutely would welcome that. Um, one of the kind of approaches around decolonisation is this understanding that actually we're all holders of knowledge. We all have the right to share something, and we should all value each other's perspectives, regardless of whatever we think is fact or not. So I think, yeah, if you have something to pitch in, an idea, a comment, a question, feel free. I would absolutely welcome that. Um, but yeah, hopefully this will be kind of a comfortable space, and yeah, I'll kind of start thinking about the topic that we're here today to talk about, and we'll definitely have some like dedicated time for a bit of a Q&A towards the end as well. So yeah, hopefully you can hear me okay, see me okay, and see the slides okay, and let me know if there's any issues. So we've already kind of had an introduction to the topic, and what I wanted to do was kind of bring things to life a little bit when we're thinking about research and intersectionality and diversity. And so the title of the specific presentation is thinking about how we go beyond single stories. And so what does diversity and intersectionality help us think about when we want to go beyond single stories? And I wanted to again bring it to life and think about children and young people in the care system, um, and kind of use a few different examples about a specific kind of group of people, and thinking about the intersecting identities that we may find if we were to do research. So yeah, hopefully that brings it to life a little bit, but hopefully it's also seen as applicable to all types of populations, of groups that yeah, research may be being undertaken on. So yeah, in terms of why we're here, I think everyone intentionally is here to an extent of wanting to learn more about equality, equity, diversity, and inclusion, and wanting to learn more about diversity. And what I'll be really trying to make the point of is that diversity is intersectional, and hopefully it's taking us from this understanding of diversity as one thing and moving it towards a more intersectional understanding of it. And we'll go into that in a lot more depth. And hopefully we'll kind of, come away from today thinking about why and how inclusion matters in lots of areas, such as health, well-being, and trust. And hopefully most helpfully for everyone here in terms of that research lens, thinking about how we apply intersectionality to research, to academia, and to practice, how we can actually apply that kind of day to day, and really exploring the danger of a single story. What happens if we only um, explore or understand a single story, and what happens if we limit ourselves, if we are not intersectional, if we don't look at diversity, what are some of the risks around that? So it is September at the moment, so I wanted to give just a little bit of context. It is my favorite month because it's my birthday month on the 27th. And so I'll need to change my bio, right? Because it's 24 at the moment. I'll have to change it to 25. Um, and so some other kind of key events that are happening in September, you've got National Inclusion Week, which is starting soon, which I think fits very well into this, kind of topic, thinking about everyone being included, and how we do that through diversity and intersectionality, as well as maybe more on the darker side, but thinking about World Suicide Prevention Day, which is actually tomorrow. and thinking about the fact that there's a real link between inclusion and exclusion, and what does that mean for the mental health and emotional well-being, especially amongst more marginalized youth. And what does that mean around kind of life chances, and hopefully just again bringing that importance of thinking about inclusion and diversity and intersectionality. So I've said that word probably a million times by now, intersectionality, and I'm going to keep saying it. And it's probably a good idea in a presentation to actually introduce that. And we can't talk about intersectionality without, referencing, giving credit to, and respecting the work of Kimberly Crenshaw, who was really, a really strong advocate for the work around this, and has kind of coined the term. And I think it's out of respect to her, kind of making sure that we get the words right. But this kind of definition or explanation of it being a lens through which you can see where power comes and collides, where it locks and intersects. It is the acknowledgement that everyone has their own unique experiences of discrimination and privilege. So I think just sitting with that for a minute in terms of the way that Crenshaw would explain intersectionality to us, and just having a look at what's on the screen in terms of the different kind of social groups, the different lenses that we may hold, the different, I guess, kind of windows that describe people in different ways. So thinking about our race, our class, our sexuality, our age, our body size, and probably millions more in terms of what kind of gives us lenses as people to kind of look into. But really this focus on, I think at the moment, if you just were to look at, this image and you just think, and you almost see it as a group of people in a room, you might just look at it and say, okay, that's diversity. You can see difference and you can potentially see similarities too. And that is diversity. And what you do next with that is I guess the question whether you celebrate that diversity or actually you disagree with that diversity. But actually intersectionality then takes that next step, which is that you can see the diversity, which we should be able to do. We should be able to see race. We should be able to see age to an extent, potentially seeing, things like gender identity. We may have stereotypes around seeing class, or hearing language, or assuming someone's religion, etc. The next step is then to think about, okay, if you are Asian in terms of your race, and this person looks quite young, and maybe they present in a way which you may think, okay, they may be from a sexual minority. What does that mean now? What do we do with that information? What does that tell us about their experiences of privilege and or discrimination? And so for me to give an example of myself, which I'm going to do quite a lot in this presentation, I have the race of being brown, Asian, kind of that's the race that I didn't choose, but it was imposed on me. It was, I was categorized as such. I wasn't kind of, I didn't choose that as a young child. And so that's one lens that people see me through and that I might see myself through. And that gives me some experience of discrimination, and racism, right? But then when I think about my ethnicity or citizenship, right, and that's very different to race. Kind of ethnically, I have a long-standing kind of, complex background and kind of ancestral background, where I was born and raised in London, right? So very much British, and I speak, my language is speaking with a very British accent. And actually that gives me a lot of privilege. So I might hold and experience discrimination in one aspect and one lens, but I have a lot of privilege with the way that I speak and the passport that I have and the citizenship that I have. I don't have to experience what it's like to be a refugee, although my parents did and my grandparents did. But I am not that experience. I might have differing experiences being a child of a refugee. But yeah, I have a British passport. I don't have to go through what some people have to go through in airports. I don't have to worry about, well, to an extent, don't have to worry about the British flags being put up, because at the moment the rhetoric is very much more against asylum seekers and refugees. Although I think it's still worrying, even not being, just being brown. Hopefully that's a kind of clear example of how intersectionality kind of invites us to think about the kind of ever-changing experiences really of both discrimination and privilege, and this real need for all of us to accept that and to reflect on our own experiences. Some people might only think that they only experience discrimination and that's it, and they are only a victim. And some people might think that they only experience privilege to an extent. And maybe there are those people, I don't know. However, I think it's more likely when you really look at everything through an intersectional lens that we have a complex relationship with both, right? And so that's hopefully what intersectionality invites us into. Did we want to pause? Are there any questions on anything that's been kind of explained so far before I go on to the next bit? Any questions or comments? Has that made you think about anything in particular? Okay, I'll move on. But again, if there is anything, please feel free to, just kind of raise your hand or just chip in. So now that we've kind of got this kind of reminder of kind of what we are talking about in terms of intersectionality, I wanted to kind of put it into practice now and kind of apply all of this thinking into research. So I'm going to invite us to think about a recent research study titled the LIPSA study. And it was a study that I was a young advisor or peer researcher for. And without going too much into kind of the study itself, because really the focus is just applying intersectionality on the study, the study did have an aim to understand how intersecting identities shaped the experiences for predominantly looking at a specific marginalized experience of being from the LGBTQ plus community and being a young person. So, I mean, those are two intersecting identities in itself. So you're thinking about gender and sexuality, and you're thinking about age. But when we start to think about other intersecting identities like disability, like citizenship, and kind of what does that tell us? What does that mean for LGBTQ plus youth in care? And so the study was co-produced with young people, aged 16 to 24, me being one of them. But we had a kind of a wider group as well. And the methods included a randomized controlled trial, which seemed to be increasing and more popular in social work nowadays and social care, as well as qualitative interviews, which I think we would expect from social care, as well as reflexive thematic analysis, which I think is pretty common, I think, across social care research nowadays. So I won't focus on this too much, but just so you can get a bit of a taste in terms of some of the findings that we were getting from the research. So what were LGBTQ plus young people telling us? So unfortunately, experiences of homophobia and transphobia from the staff, which is very concerning, and peers, which is to an extent to be expected. Misgendering, kind of creating unsafe environments. So a young person saying he would misgender me, placing me in a dangerous situation. There was findings around unmet health needs. So thinking about mental health struggles kind of being trivialized, or kind of linked to, when young people are sharing that they're struggling with their identity. Anything on sexual health education not really being inclusive of obviously the wider kind of experiences of gender and sexual minorities, and staff members being quite oppressive, kind of talking about, you deserve to have these issues or these mental health problems because of your situation. So that kind of more direct, kind of oppressive practice. And a real key finding was that actually relationships really matter. So young people talking about, how important it was to have affirming staff. But then also when you didn't have that because of rapid staff turnover, and how that broke trust, and how it's really difficult to build those relationships when you don't have supportive staff being there consistently. So yeah, some really kind of stark findings from this study. But what does it actually tell us about intersectionality? And so what we found is that there was a real greater disadvantage for some specific kind of minorities within the minorities, or within the different lenses or social categories that we were kind of working with in the study. So thinking about girls and young women were at a kind of more disadvantage in terms of some of these experiences, like around unmet health needs, and that discrimination. Thinking about more specific disadvantages for transgender youth, and that very much more specific lens. So although we can talk about the LGBTQ plus community, actually there are more specifics within every single letter, and including in the plus, right? So thinking about transgender youth having to deal with very, I'd say, dangerous and complicated debates that happen, amongst the media, that then filter themselves back into children's homes and foster placements, foster homes, that kind of create that sense of insecurity and danger for young people. And then as well as thinking about what it meant to be LGBTQ plus as well as a racialized minority. So thinking about who do you go to in times of wanting to explore identity. Would those young people be going to someone from their racialized background, or would they feel that shame and stigma potentially within their culture? So I think there was some real kind of clear experiences of how there was that experience of potentially privilege as well as that experience of discrimination, and how young people were navigating kind of a bit in everything. And I guess a key finding around intersectionality is, I mean, in this research study, we were prepared for it. We knew what we were looking for, and we were able to kind of explore that, in quite a lot of depth. But actually, if it was a research study that wanted to only focus on those two lenses of LGBTQ plus young people, and didn't factor in all the needs around diversity and intersectionality, I mean, yeah, it possibly wouldn't even pass an ethics application, right? In terms of not being prepared, in being able to kind of hold space, and keep young people protected, and safe, and yeah, not experiencing harm through the research, right? Now, I've kind of put these thoughts around all of this kind of being a bit of a double-edged sword, and inclusivity not really being person-centered, because I think a lot of what I see in research and in academia is that there is this real push and this mission towards inclusivity, and EDI or DEI or whatever the acronym is going to be in that organization. And what it really misses is this understanding of real kind of diversity and intersectionality within that inclusivity. So it's one thing to say, yeah, we're going to make everyone feel included, right? It's like that example of saying, well, it's a children's home, we're not doing anything over the summer, let's take everyone out to football. But actually, half the young people don't even like football, or it might just be the one that doesn't like football. And actually, so this understanding of inclusivity, of just saying everyone can do something or everyone comes together, actually needs a lot of particular thinking, and it needs an intersectional approach to thinking to be able to really take us forward to a point where inclusivity means we acknowledge the differing experiences of power and discrimination and privilege and oppression, etc. So hopefully that's making sense in terms of applying it in practice. Any thoughts before I go on to the next bit? Yeah, we've got a hand up, I think, from Joe.
Yeah, just interesting when you said that you as a researcher or as a research team understood that there was a difference for those racialized minority who were also from the LGBTQ plus community. And I'm just wondering if the young people themselves recognise that, or did they just think that they were being underserved by the care home system, or is that a lens, an academic lens, or is that something that they saw as well?
Yeah, no, that's always a really good question, actually. You know, how so one of the things that makes me think about is, would this research team have had that understanding, that more academic lens, without the lived experience of young people being able to talk to that themselves anyway, right? And I think it reminds me of the importance of research studies being co-produced. And I've worked with these researchers before, and so I know a little bit of their specific kind of background and like commitment to social justice and understanding and intersectionality. But I think, and it may sound like I'm kind of, you know, blowing my own horn or whatever, but I wonder how different the study would have been if myself and other young advisors weren't included, you know, weren't steering, weren't co-peer researchers, because it was our lived experience that kind of, I guess, prompted, encouraged, and steered the research team to explore this in a bit more depth and be ready for it. So, you know, there was a very specific question on intersectionality. It wasn't the focus of the study to talk about racial and ethnic discrimination, but there was still that question around, you know, the kind of identity and thinking about, is there anything else, you know, that makes you you, in terms of, you know, that you'd want to talk about in your experiences, and then kind of going through the protected characteristics as a kind of almost list to explore each one. And so, yeah, hopefully it just reminds us of the importance of engaging with lived experience and co-producing before undertaking or, you know, designing a research study. Because if that didn't happen, right? So if you just go and do the research study and then you unexpectedly get certain things, well, then you're less prepared. You maybe haven't got the kind of procedures in place to navigate that. But if you've actually kind of already done it, or, you know, you kind of almost started some low-level kind of data gathering by doing co-production, then maybe you're in a better place to handle that moving forward.
Thank you.
Yeah, no worries. Thank you, because you've reminded me to make those points. Any other comments or questions? Yeah.
Thank you. I think one of the things that strikes me as you're talking is kind of that tension when you want a study to be co-produced, but you're involving, you know, probably some of the most vulnerable subgroups of subgroups of subgroups of people, however you want to describe them. And I think sometimes there is a bit of a tension in research there, because we've got, you know, so many governance requirements, obviously that your study would have raised safeguarding requirements. So I just wondered how, if you've got any advice about kind of navigating that whole space.
Yeah, that's a really, really good question. I mean, I actually do like whole day trainings on co-production. So I will try to do your question justice in maybe a few a few sentences. But I guess what that tells us is that there is a lot to say around good co-production, being in that space of balancing governance and how research needs to move forward with, bringing people along with us and keeping people safe and really having kind of that reciprocal benefit to both the research team as well as the people you're doing co-production with, so like the experts by experience. And actually, how do we have both that reciprocal benefit as well as benefits for the whole team? So what I mean by that is, again, inclusivity might mean that we have an advisory group, right? And I always say in my training and anytime I do work with organizations is that I really don't like the idea of an advisory group because it doesn't give anyone power. It's advice, right? Whereas if it's a steering group, even just that language tells you that those young people now have some power. And whether you write that power, whether you dictate the rules and regulations of that power, just the language enough is power to say, you're not just advising me, you're going to steer this group. You're going to, we really respect your views and your knowledge, and that's going to help. So, in some ways, working with the most marginalized communities, it is about recognizing in those spaces how inclusive are the spaces anyway, thinking about the intersectional experiences of the research team and of the co-production experts coming in, who experiences that power, that privilege, that oppression, that discrimination in those spaces, and how do we navigate that? And you look at kind of Arnstein's kind of Arnstein's, I'm trying to pronounce the name, ladder of kind of participation, and you think about the different levels of kind of working with people and co-production. And it might be that we want to look at the top end of the ladder, which is complete citizen control, right? So having these co-production experts come in and say, well, actually, we're the people with the big research jobs, and we're getting the money to an extent, so we're going to do the grunt of the work, but actually we want you to take that control. You tell us exactly what needs to be done. So it might be that I don't think that's the right approach always. I think if there's a reason for it, go for it. But to have this almost kind of balance of saying the power dynamics are going to shift here, I think that creates the space and the opportunity to then create safety, and it allows the people to have that power to say, well, like this is how I'm going to be included here. And you might have some co-production experts say, thank you for asking, but actually I don't want that much control. I can only dedicate 1 hour a month to this, and that's okay, because the power has been shared for them to make that choice because they have their own agency, right? So yeah, I think anyone and everyone has experience of power and discrimination, power and privilege and oppression, etc., etc. And so it's just about having those intersectional conversations, and creating space for all of that, which hopefully creates safety.
Thank you.
No worries. Thank you again for reminding me to talk about all of that. Okay, I'm gonna move us on if that's okay. And this next bit is a bit wordy. I think I'm going to talk for a little while here. But because what I wanted to do, so there's a bit on the screen now, which is probably distracting, is kind of introduce to you intersectionality in practice, right? And intersectionality in a way where you are dealing with complex racial, ethnic, and ancestral and cultural diversity, as well as kind of gender and sexual diversity, and so many more lenses, right? And how intersectionality invites us to think about all these different aspects of of just one person, right? And actually, you know, maybe kind of the system of that person, so like the family and the professionals that work with them, etc. And I keep talking about this person as a third person, but it's me. And so I'm gonna you know, kind of use myself as an example, and kind of go through my experience. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to use the narrative therapy tool kind of assessment, of the tree of life, which is one of my favorite kind of assessment tools. And really what it's going to maybe introduce is going to introduce some more kind of like systemic ideas, thinking about externalizing problems and cultural context and building new narratives. And maybe that's really interesting. And I'll talk a bit about that. But the thing that I really want everyone to get out of me, it kind of explaining some of this, is inviting you into a real kind of deepness into intersectionality by using my own experience, right? So hopefully it's interesting, but it will require me to talk a little bit and kind of present the story, if that's okay, that I've kind of written. I don't know if anyone has seen the narrative therapy tree of life before. I'll kind of very briefly describe it, but you've got it on the screen. So it's basically, you've got to imagine me as a tree. I'd probably want to be like an oak tree, I don't know. And you kind of analyze or kind of unpick or kind of assess different aspects, through kind of how you would assess a tree, right? So you look at the roots, which in my culture is where you always start from, is kind of where I come from, my family, my ancestry, etc. The ground, so where I live, the present life, what I do on a day-to-day, my trunk, my skills and my interests, my branches, my hopes, dreams and wishes, the fruit, so the fruit that was given to me. And I don't think it's always added into the narrative therapy, but what I always do is not just the fruits that are given to me, but the fruits that I then hope to give to others. So thinking about the past, present, and future. The leaves, so the important people in my life, and then the storms, or if people like storms, then you can use bugs, because some people don't like bugs. But basically the challenges in life, right, that kind of interrupt the tree. So thinking about losses, the lack of resources, the stressful events, right? So that is kind of hopefully an introduction to the tree of life. And yeah, I'm going to hopefully try to introduce it, utilizing my own experience and kind of inviting you to think about intersectionality, right? A lot of words here, so I'll kind of leave you to just skim some of that. But I guess if I was to kind of introduce things, so you've got lots and lots of different labels for me, right? Maybe the one that I didn't talk about, is in terms of like sexuality and having 16 years of childhood involvement with social workers. So that's something that I kind of, you know, bring to the table in terms of that lived experience. And kind of the rationale of kind of using the narrative tree of life is very much thinking about using a more kind of intersectional approach to kind of reimagine support for kind of my own identity exploration, and how that helped to kind of go away from this danger of the single story. So to kind of really countering single stories, and helping to kind of externalize problems and reduce conflicts. And it links into like lots of different systemic ideas, like family scripts. So it will kind of go into my kind of cultural context of the kind of the Persian, Indian, East African heritage, the both kind of Islamic and Ismaili faith, which are kind of different, but in the same to some extent, as well as I think I've talked a little bit about kind of like migration and intergenerational trauma and, you know, what it's like to be racially minoritized in the UK, and how actually the tree of life really can have this intersectional approach to map influences and reduce bias and kind of empower stories, right? I realize what I'm doing is I've just kind of gone straight into analysing the tree of life without giving you the story first. So I'll continue with the last slide, then I'll actually give you the story. And so kind of what else, you know, was kind of really beneficial about thinking about the tree of life was thinking about how it could have been used to discover identity through my lens and kind of build multiple stories and explore unique outcomes. So again, taking this more intersectional way of working with a child. There was kind of a lot of bias, you know, within kind of social work practice that I, you know, was kind of growing up with. And actually what would have helped, or what could have changed, is challenging some of the dominant discourses. So a lot of the stereotypes from my social workers, their stereotypes around culture and race and sexuality, and actually the tree of life being done with me as a child actually would have helped me reflect on my own wishes and feelings as a child. And actually, yeah, it would have been a very conscious intersectional approach, and being able to dispel some of those stereotypes and that sort of thing. So some of the key learnings for practice was that it's able to kind of risk assess what's happening for a child through the child's lens, and using narrative intersectional approaches destabilizes problem saturated stories. So too often a child is unfortunately experiencing, ongoing, like, this is the problem, as a social worker I've come to visit you because there's problems. And actually, yes, there's problems, but there's also beauty in what happens in a child's life, and how do we kind of also talk about the nice stuff that happens. And yeah, I think if it was used, then the tree of life would have given me that power, that intersectional power, to kind of share narratives to influence change that was happening for me as a child. See, I realized, sorry, I was meant to introduce the story and then go into analysing it, but I analysed it first, and now I'm going to introduce the story. So sorry if that was confusing. So yeah, I'm going to kind of read this out to you guys, and then yeah, we can kind of have a discussion around it, if that's okay. So as someone, that has kind of grew up with a kind of complex kind of sexual identity, as someone that's grew up with social workers for the first 16 years, I very much had to kind of grapple with how and all of that kind of impacted my ability to explore myself and my identity, which actually every child does, right? But then also how both the social workers' kind of identity and intersectionalities impacted the ability to engage and work with my family's kind of intersectional identities, and then what that then meant for myself. And so again, it's linking to those points around how there were lots of kind of dominant discourses, this idea that you probably had a lovely social worker who, went on some inclusivity training and thought, oh, I need to be inclusive. So, I need to, talk about, the fact that this family is brown, and, I need to ask questions and and maybe ask questions that would actually be quite dangerous, asking potentially about sexuality in front of the whole family, which, potentially would have been dangerous. And so, yeah, just thinking about, again, that move from inclusivity to intersectionality. So I've kind of introduced narrative therapy a little bit, but it's very much thinking about, and it's really, really useful, I think, working with families who've experienced kind of long-term involvement, which would have been mine. And I guess in the story, I kind of, because I'm just summarizing it now. So, what I would have liked throughout my childhood is that tree of life approach, because really what that would have done is it would have helped me discover and explore my own identity, my own narrative, and my own story through my lens, right? Not through the lens of others' kind of power and due to their own intersectional identities. And so this obviously wasn't done. But actually what the starting process would have been was, children kind of need to be reminded, and kind of relearn that children don't cause the problems between parents. And actually there are lots of possibilities to move away from a really problem saturated description of life. And, that tree of life approach, again, because it's intersectional, would have come away from just single stories. So, whatever the social worker thought of, race and culture and sexuality, and whatever my parents thought, well, actually, no one asked the child, me, kind of what I thought, right? And actually, there's so much that would have given context to things like homophobia. When I think about the traditional knowledge and practices coming from a very Persian, Indian, and East African ancestral context, but then also coming from that religious context of Islam and Ismailism, as well as the context of migration and colonialism and intergenerational trauma. Actually, if I was supported through that, and again, that intersectional approach was taken, I would have understood the single story narrative from my parents, because I now understand it today, that actually they just reproduce what they were given, right? You know, it's almost this life cycle, these scripts that they were given. And, you know, they actually had good intentions, you know, even if they were homophobic, right? But intentions in the sense of wanting their child to conform to society and to culture and religion, but because they had to, right? You know, when they first came here as refugees and, you know, were laughed at for eating with their hands or whatever, you know, this experience that was forced down them, you know, then became a script for them to also do, which, you know, obviously had an impact, right? But again, it's like that intersectionality and that meaning of how you can give power, how you can give meaning to differing experiences that are really, really complicated and complex. So yeah, I think, you know, the Tree of Life approach would have helped me understand that intersectionality. It would have helped me value my religious and ancestral and cultural context around that kind of reasonable concern. I think my parents would have had, maybe not even just for me, but the concern about society, right? That they know that they can help me in the home, but they can't help me in society, and kind of what I would have experienced, right? And actually, the Tree of Life approach, again with the intersectionality of it, would have showed me unique outcomes, and it would have externalized the problem and find times when the problem was less present, right? So thinking about times where actually, you know, there'd be a TV program, you know, and you know, a married male couple, and actually it was fine, and we'd continue watching it. Actually, so there were times where, you know, there were kind of those unique outcomes and the problem was less present. And maybe thinking like the last thing that would have been really helpful, that the Tree of Life would have been able to do is, you know, not just the social worker doing it with the child, but doing it with not even just the parents, but everyone in the system. So CAMS, you know, the schools, etc. And actually, how can everyone build their intersectional understanding of what's happening? And obviously, the Tree of Life is just one way to do that in practice. You know, and again, it's that kind of ability to move away from this understanding of that low level inclusivity and diversity and really thinking about the differing experiences and lenses that are happening for that young person. So just trying to think what else to say in terms of the story. I mean, I could probably talk a little bit more about kind of in practice, you know, how to do Tree of Life well, but I think that's more for a social work practitioner, and less thinking about like what all this means for research. So I think I'll stop there in terms of kind of introducing the Tree of Life and maybe just summarize it as, you know, again, it's very much a tool. It's an assessment approach, and it's just an introduction to, you know, a real deep understanding into the complexities of people and the need to take an intersectional approach to be able to work with people, to understand people, yeah, to be able to do good research, basically. And I think the reason why I talk about it more specifically as it wasn't done with me as a child, and I wish it was, is that kind of reminder, for all future research that comes, is that it's not too late, and actually we need to be you know, supporting the next generation, or, you know, of research to really take that intersectional approach, to make sure that we're not missing things. And again, it links into what I was saying about the single story narratives and actually how kind of debilitating and you know, there was so much missed opportunity there. I always say it's like, you know, it's almost like painting a picture of a child without using its favorite color, you know? And my favorite color is purple. And, you know, I think without an intersectional understanding, you can't really paint that picture in the way that the child would be proud of, if that makes sense. So yeah, hopefully that was useful to an extent. Sorry, I kind of did it the other way around, but hopefully it still made sense. Before I go on to some of the recommendations, then, did anyone have any questions, thoughts, comments on any of that?
I'm just wary of time, so maybe we
Yes.
can leave a couple of minutes for any questions after the slides. Yeah.
Perfect. There's only a few more slides to go. So hopefully then, to summarize, to bring everything together, the recommendation that I'd want to share with everyone here today is that we need to be thinking about how we put intersectionality into our procedures, our policies, our practice. So thinking about how we have a policy which explicitly covers intersectionality, whether that's within the EDI, policies, etc., or whether it's its own kind of thing. I think there's benefits and drawbacks to both. And making sure that our staff are understanding of intersectionality, so having that knowledge training, making sure that we've got kind of staff who will affirm the need for intersectionality, and then maybe even people here today that will go away and say, I don't really like these ideas, and I'm not that affirming about it. But actually we still need staff that are affirming about it to be able to continue that conversation, because I never hope to change everyone in just one sitting. This will be an ongoing conversation, and hopefully I leave you with a lot to think about, and you make your own decision on that, which is what I would value more. And yeah, use more kind of like narrative intersectional tools, whether that's kind of promoting certain research methods, or different approaches like the Tree of Life, like narrative interviewing as a research methodology, etc. And I think, bringing it all to, again, like what this really means for research, I think being able to take a more intersectional design really improves like the sampling of who we're able to have and to look at. It enables us to think about people in a much more kind of deeper way. And I think when we start to get data, I think it really helps us interpret data in a much more kind of richer and deeper way as well. And I think as someone that sits on, review ethical applications, a lot, over the last few years, and I see this coming up more and more, the lack of intersectionality in research bids and study designs. And so I think, yeah, it's becoming more and more of a kind of an ethical principle as well. And hopefully the story that I've kind of shared with you today helps you think about how taking intersectionality combats the erasure of lived experience and flawed conclusions, people making judgments and thinking that they have got the correct answer without actually exploring the whole story. Again, it's like painting the picture without purple, right? And so, yeah, the call to action is, hopefully you've understood today that diversity is complex and inclusion is essential, and we need to take an intersectional approach. And yeah, let's absolutely embed intersectionality in all the different areas that we all work in. And that is the end of the presentation. Thank you all. And yeah, very happy for questions in the last 10 minutes.